Habari gani, karibuni, asanteni kwa kuwa nasi. So the name is Nduku. I am the host on Kumbukeni. Kumbukeni is where we are reclaiming our narrative, telling the WanaUbuntu African narrative from an African perspective. So we have been offering these free political, history, civic, and social education since the Kenyan Maandamano, because we've always wanted to offer these. It's just that the time is not there. It's still not there, but we need to make time because clearly this information is needed. And this was emphasized more as I was interacting with my fellow Kenyans during the Kenyan protests, the recent Kenyan protests, Maandamano, where you realize as you're talking to fellow Africans, WanaUbuntu, that people do not understand what truly is behind their current situation, right? The Kenyans were calling for Ruto must go, but Ruto must go is a temporary solution. In fact, it's not a solution, because when Ruto goes, there are many others who have been prepared and trained and what was programmed, for lack of a better word, by the imperialist nations to take on and continue their agenda, to take on and continue serving their interests. So Ruto must go is not enough. It must be, we have to look under Ruto and see who is controlling the puppet that is Ruto, and that is who we must address. Today's lesson is going to cover, again, we are still on Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. We are going to be looking at chapter 5 and 6 because we missed a lesson last week. I needed some time for myself. The goal of today's lesson is to understand how colonialism systemically underdeveloped Africa, to identify the specific exploitative mechanisms used during colonialism, to compare colonial era practices with modern day economic actions, especially focusing on neo-colonialism and China's role in Africa. I focus on China not to take the Western strategy of here's the boogeyman, but to show you, my fellow WanaUbuntu Africans, that China is not the solution, that China is doing the very same thing that you're rejecting from the West. They may not appear to, but they are. And discuss how multinational corporations and Western interests have maintained economic dominance over Africa. I have recommended on this, and today I am going to use this book to juxtapose against and support Baba Walter Rodney's observations. Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Parkins, and the new Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Parkins as well, where he added the original book focuses on the economic hitman's activities outside of the United States. In the new Confessions, he adds some things he didn't cover in that aspect, but he also adds how these individuals are operating within the United States and exploiting their own people. A lot of politicians, US politicians involved in this, they even during Obama's presidency. So for those of you who think choosing Democrat or Republican makes a difference, this is where you understand it truly doesn't, because all these people are involved in the system that exploits us, whether they are Democrat, whether they are Republican. In the book, it is revealed that all the presidencies, Democrat or Republican, had some form of exploitation going on to advance US interests and the growth of the US empire. So we'll start quickly because we are always running out of time with the conclusion, the last paragraph of chapter 5. Walter Rodney says, colonialism strengthened the Western Europe ruling class and capitalism as a whole. Particularly in its later phases, it was evidently giving a new lease of life to a mode of production that was otherwise dying. From every viewpoint other than that of the minority class of capitalists, colonialism was a monstrous institution holding back the liberation of man. In other words, from every viewpoint other than the elite who benefit from the capitalist system, everyone else saw or understood, whether they had the will to fight it or not, understood that this system was holding back the liberation of man. So in other words, Europe was not doing well. And then they sit together, they come together and sit and they decide, you know what, we are falling apart, we're about to lose it, but there's a land apparently somewhere that has resources. and we can split it amongst ourselves, because at that point they're starting to fight. Some of them have already gotten here and are starting to fight over who owns what and that. And we can expand on this exploitation and rebuild our economy. So colonial governments and the private companies, and Chapter 5 especially, is the place where, actually Chapter 6, Chapter 5 and 6, you need to go to trace the evidence of these companies. You have the Cadburys, you have the Barclays Bank, like the Lloyds of London, how they started, that they were companies that grew, that were formed and grew from the enslavement of WanaUbuntu Africans. Walter Rodney tells us that colonial governments were set up to ensure that private companies could operate freely in exploiting Africa's natural resources. I mean, Nigeria started as a company. It didn't even start as a nation. The Niger Company, that's how Nigeria started. We have a key example in the mining in South Africa, right? You all here today, we're talking about the Oppenheimers. How did they start? The colonial governments collaborated with companies like De Beers, right? Led by figures like Oppenheimer, Harry F. Oppenheimer. So go home, if you have a computer, if you have internet, and Google Harry F. Oppenheimer and trace from then how his descendants have exploited South Africa and Africa in general. So their goal was to extract African wealth, including its people. We see today, we come from that and we take that knowledge and understanding. Once you Google these people and see how they moved then, you take that knowledge and understanding and come back today and see how it's playing out in our times today. You see Chinese mining companies and their extensive operations in Zambia and the DRC, ensuring China gets critical minerals for technological development while local labor is exploited. So recently, I was speaking to some contacts in Zambia about the cost of living in Zambia. And they said to me, the cost of living is good. And yes, from the figures they were showing me, yes, it is good. But I was told that it just yesterday was told that it is starting to get expensive. Why? Because of the debt that they have with China. Because of that debt essentially, because it is set up. So for those of you who think that China is the solution, China took the model, the same model of the US, of the economic hitmen, and are using the same model, but they have perfected it. So with the US, the main thing was fear. The pillars that control the system, right? Fear, debt were the main things. Today, debt is the main one, actually, and fear through their military industry. And that's part of putting the bases in your nations, your African nations. That's part of that, right? So no African will dare stand up as long as they know there's some bombs next door at the British military base, at the US military base. No African, and this happens today. When I say Africans must stand up, you hear them saying, how are we going to do that? These people have superior weapons to us. That's the fear. And because of that fear, a lot of Africans go along to get along so that they are not killed. China is not using that. China is using an even more conniving or deceptive strategy. China is using perception, right? The perception that we are your saviors. We are not like the West. We don't do this and that and that. We are not. What's the word? We are not requiring, right, you to follow certain. You can go on and be whoever you want. We're not giving sanctions on you, right? We are going to improve your economy. We're going to build roads. We're going to build infrastructure. And all we need is resources, just here. And we're going to support them, right, with the loans that you require. But we don't realize that these loans end up becoming debts. The way they are set up is intentionally so that we default on them, and therefore the debt. And when we default on them, that's when they come back and say, okay, I mean, as any person who lends you money, so you cannot pay me money, but you have assets. And so let's leverage this debt with your assets. And therefore, that is where they now start exploiting the minerals and the natural resources in Ubuntu. And then the other thing about the colonial governments that helped these nations and private businesses grow was the heavy taxation. So Africans were taxed even as they continued to not get yes, I agree with you, Armstrong. Yes. Karibu sana. So Africans were taxed heavily, even as they were not being given service, even as they were being exploited. So we, to this day, back then to this day, we pay taxes into a system that exploits us. Those of you in the United States, you know very how this plays out. You know, what's it called? The tax code, how it is structured, where Rupert Murdoch can get away with paying less than his secretary as far as taxes, right? Less than his secretary. The billionaire who owns the billion-dollar company pays less than his secretary who owns a fragment of it, or doesn't even own the company, who is paid by the company. And this is how it's set up. And through The Color of Law, this is another book I recommend, The Color of Law. I forget the author, but look up The Color of Law. You will see how the tax code is intentionally designed to overtax the marginalized, especially Black people, while giving them less services, right? And you have white folk walking around talking about, oh, he got that job because of affirmative action. They got that because of affirmative action. Or they got that, the standards have been reduced to accommodate Black people. No. Black people have been feeding into your economy, not just within the United States, not before you even stole them from their motherland and brought them to the United States to force them to work. They were financing your economy since then. One way, through heavy taxation. The Kenyans know this because this is something you're currently fighting. The reason why your taxation is not going down and it keeps increasing is the constant trips that your so-called leaders are taking to get debt, because they're not paying the debt that they had before, and they're going to get more, and defaulting and defaulting and defaulting. And because they're not paying it, these people that they owe are finding other ways to get it paid. One of them is heavy taxation. And then, like I said before, the extraction and exploitation of your resources. So colonial taxes forced Africans into the cash economy to survive. You all know this. We live paycheck to paycheck, right? Driving cheap labor from plantations, mines, and European-owned businesses. We have the example of the Manga people. And these examples are supposed to give you an idea so that you can start opening your eyes and seeing in your current state of being different other examples in your localities. So the Manga people in French West Africa, who were prevented from hunting and forced to farm cash crops like cotton, so specifically to farm cotton. The French government introduced a policy that forced them from hunting. So this is where you have these policies that will penalize. So if an African is hunting, they're going to be penalized, they're going to be criminalized, they're going to be imprisoned. And the only thing that is accepted is you being on the cotton farming. Right? It forces you into that, because in your head, you're like, okay, so now we know we don't have meat, right? We don't have food. We don't have the money to buy the food. We need money now in order to buy food. And the only place clearly in my locality that is offering money is the cotton farm that's owned by the Mzungu, French Mzungu. So this is the things that they are doing to force us into servitude. Today, you see how African governments under pressure from international loans. Again, that is the key driving force today. This is the key tool they're using to subjugate us today, is debt. So international loans, NGOs, whatever you call it, US aid. US aid is aiding no one but the US. It is right in the name. US aid. It aids the US. The US aid has been built to funnel funds from the nations they're exploiting through it to clean it and take it to corporations. So they impose taxes that benefit foreign investors more than their citizens. You see this in Kenya. I mentioned the story. Well, I think I was doing the Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped readings. I was listening to them, one of chapter 5 and 6. I mentioned the story of how I was working with a Kenyan fabric African clothing manufacturer or producer to get some samples sent here so that we can see what the cost of shipping was going to be in order to determine the price of our products. And we used a Kenyan company to give us a quote, which was really high. We couldn't afford it. And then I recommended, let's go look at DHL. What are they offering, right? An international company. It was way significantly less than the African company, which means DHL is getting away with paying less expenses, whichever way it is, whether it's taxed, not being taxed, not being required to meet certain costs as they're running business in Kenya. But Kenya is taking the cost from DHL, which can afford to be charged these costs, and putting it on the backs of Kenyan business owners, right, who cannot essentially afford it and have to charge high prices in order to meet that expense and have a decent profit margin. So taxation is another way they did then and do today to keep us subjugated, another tool that they used. So you have agriculture under colonialism, how it operated. Colonial governments controlled agriculture to ensure people were dependent on the colonial system. I mentioned the Manga people. Africans were taxed for practicing agricultural methods that could have liberated them, such as subsistence farming. So in Kenya, this was a big deal, especially with the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, the Kikuyu. They were penalized if they farmed. So if on your farm, you actually farmed some cabbage, some beans, some peanuts, some sweet potatoes, and you were penalized. And they get to a point where they actually abduct the Kikuyus and they put them in a camp. What do you call them? You know, like the ones they had in German. Someone put it in the chat. What do you call those camps? Essentially, people are put there and they cannot move freely. They cannot operate freely. Their freedoms are taken and they are monitored 24/7 and have to operate under a certain system. And on top of it, too, they're being brutalized, right? Beaten, exploited. They have to be forced to work for those governments. Today, how do we see that today, right? And so the example is cotton farming, like we mentioned with the Manga, and also palm oil exploitation in Nigeria. This was a huge one using the West African Produce Board. And we see that starting to seep back in today with these nations that are selling large pieces of land to grow palms, right? This is not good. And then today we see land grabbing by foreign companies. You're hearing of these Middle East companies, Israeli companies buying land in WanaUbuntu, right? For example, in Ethiopia, where they're displacing, and Tanzania today, the Maasais, you've been seeing that in the headlines, those of you who are reading news. But if you're not reading, go look, Google, Maasai community in Tanzania. They're being forced to leave their homelands, their own ancestral land. Like, I don't know when these governments, and we must look at the policies that have decided that this land belongs to these governments, because land never belonged to government, ever in WanaUbuntu. Land belonged to the community that was residing on the piece of land. And therefore, the Maasai have every right to say, you cannot come here. If they had the capability to defend themselves, if they had weapons that matched the weapons that the government is currently using with the help of the international entities, they have every right to blow the people who come there to pieces. Every single right, because the land is theirs, based on our protocol, our legal system, our culture. And it will do us good, WanaUbuntu, to stop following the legal system of our oppressor and start going back to our own legal system, right? I've had people accusing me, you're doing something illegal, you're doing something illegal. What illegal thing am I doing? According to who, right? According to the oppressor, of course it is illegal. If I'm fighting oppression, if I'm fighting exploitation, of course what I'm doing is illegal from their perspective. From my perspective, and it should be from my communities, it is a shame that my community will jump on the wagon of the West, of their perspective, and call me criminal. My community should stand and defend me, right? My community should stand and defend me, because guess what I'm doing? I am defending you. I'm fighting exploitation, our collective exploitation, which means we have to break laws. One example of a law like this in agriculture currently, in Kenya, you recently saw they're banning the farming of ndengu, right? I forget what the grain is called in English. Marjoram? I forget. They've banned the growing of ndengu also, and they're penalizing and criminalizing it. And they're getting to a point where now they want to introduce, I don't know if it has passed yet, a policy where in order to practice farming, you're going to need to have an agricultural degree, right? At the same time, I'm certain they're making sure that you having access to that degree or the education that gives you that degree is going to be hard. And therefore, you will not essentially be able to acquire the thing that they are making a condition for you to practice farming. And therefore, there'll be no farming. The only people who will be farming in Kenya, if we allow the government to do what it's doing right now under the imperial system, the only people who will be farming will be these multinational companies. So the only people, if we let what is happening continue, who will be farming on our motherland will be the Monsantos, whatever Chinese companies they introduce, and other multinational companies. And we will be dependent on them for the food that we eat, which they're clearly poisoning, as you've seen in the evidence of increased illnesses amongst our people, like cancer. Then you have forced labor and public works. This public works, you know, you read Walter Rodney sometimes and you get angry. I decided to, because I had the recordings on our channel, I took the advice that I have given you all and listened. That's how I revisited the chapters, by listening to the recordings that I had put out that we have on Kumbukeni on chapter 5 and 6. And I was doing it as I was going for my walks in the morning, as I do my workout rituals, morning workouts. And as I'm walking, I'm getting frustrated. And every time I was walking, I was stopping just to take notes, despite the fact that on the book I have marked and I have notes, just to take note of the thing that was being said. And public works was one of them, where I just stood and I was cursing as I was walking. Like, the people walking around me are probably thinking, this woman has lost it. To some extent, I have lost it, right? Because this stuff is insane. This is ridiculous. This is enough to drive anyone crazy. So back then, what fell under public works, and I'm giving Kenya as an example as well. Kenyans were forced to, and it was seen as public works, which means, by the way, public works meant that you were not being paid. It was your service to the government, a colonial government, right? Remember, it's forced service. So it's not really your service to the government. It's forced labor. So essentially, building you have, why am I forgetting these locations? In Nairobi, the golf club, I'll remember it. All those nice buildings you see in Karen, those great mansions were built by our people free of charge. Now, this is where I usually like to juxtapose with our brothers and sisters in the United States, claiming that they have their plight was greater than the plight of those who were left on the continent. In Kenya, especially, we see enslavement happening on the ground in Kenya. If you're working, you're not getting paid, and you're being commissioned to build buildings, build structures, build infrastructure without payment, and you're being told it's public works, what is that? What do you describe that other than enslavement? And this was happening in Kenya. So all those buildings for the governors, all those buildings for British offices, I'm almost certain a lot of the government buildings were built free of charge because it was public works service. So you were forced to build colonial infrastructure without pay. The roads, the mansions, the prisons where some of you are going to end up being held, paid without pay, and the government buildings. So a question that came to mind and I think Walter asks these questions, which is why it's triggered it to me too. If we were the ones building these roads, mansions, prisons in the United States as well, right? The White House was built by enslaved Africans. Why did we not take notes and learn? Why did we, and we're afraid to implement? Why do we not today, right? Those Kenyans who are being used to build the railway tracks that the Chinese is laying down. Those Kenyans, because the managers are Chinese, but the Kenyans are doing the hard work. Why are you not observing? Why go to those jobs with a mission to observe and learn, so that once we have learned and observed, we will kick them out, and then we ourselves will take on the building of our infrastructure. We have to start thinking in that way. Those of us who are in these spaces where we have been forced to, by circumstances, to work in these spaces that are exploiting our people, let's change the mission. Let's make it our mission, not their mission, because they all have these missions that are bullshit, essentially, on in their organizations. But let's now operate covertly with our own mission, to liberate our people. So go in those spaces to learn their system, to learn how things are done, so that we can take it, restructure it in our own African way, and implement. You have modern examples of forced labor. I mentioned the Chinese. The China Belt and Road Initiative, where African nations take on debt to finance infrastructure built by Chinese companies. The roads are still very strategically placed to this day. These roads, by the way, they didn't build these schools, these government buildings, these roads to help us. No. If they built it to help us, it would be easy. I should be able to catch a train, a local subway from Eastlands to Westlands or city center in Nairobi. There should be subways running all over in Ubuntu, just as they are in the West. If these people's goal was to civilize us, civilization should be reflected the way it is in their Western nations back on our continent. I shouldn't go to Africa. I hear Africans on WanaUbuntu saying, oh, we should be like the West. We should have roads like the West. We should look at the West and ask, if we have been getting loans from you, if we have been signing contracts with your engineering companies, if we have been signing contracts with Maine, one of the companies, it changed names, I think it ran out of business, taken over by another one. If we have been signing contracts with your companies, China, why is our infrastructure not looking like what it does in China? Why is it not looking like what it does in London? Why is it not looking like what it does in the United States? And especially if you want to claim that you civilized us. So we're putting that blame on your shoulders, but we're not putting it and just sitting back. We're putting it and saying, or we should put it on your backs and say, enough is enough. You clearly are not serving us. You must leave. Leave. You must leave. And we are going to take on the building of our own economy. You have, and again, oh, I'm glad we still have time. Good. So I'm trying to rush so that we do not run out of time again today. Neocolonialism and modern economic exploitation, right? Multinational corporations and the continuation of exploitation. I will recommend this book again. This book is written by a Mzungu, but it is a Mzungu who, through his conscience, decided to expose, again, it's called Confessions, to confess his role in the exploitative system and expose that system, because he decided when he had, it's for selfish reasons, but thank goodness it is for selfish reasons, because without those selfish reasons, we wouldn't know what he has exposed. His selfish reason was his daughter was born and he had a grandchild. Number one, with his daughter, he didn't want her to have a future, to be in a system that the one he was building. He didn't want his daughter's future to be dependent on that. He didn't want his grandchildren to be under that system. And therefore, he had to destroy that system. One of the ways to destroy that system is to expose it fast so that people can learn about it, so that you can have more people joining you to destroy it. And he recommends transitioning, doing everything that is necessary to transition from a death economy, is what he's calling it, and into a life economy. I'm saying into a life-giving economy, right? We know that Africans as Ubuntu, we know that as Ubuntu. Ubuntu is also a life-taking principle. How does Ubuntu take life? Ubuntu, the way that taking life is Ubuntu is it's not done in the Western way, where you just take life randomly for the sake of it, for personal benefits, for selfish reasons. No. Life is taken if it threatens the well-being of the community. I'm talking about defense. Ubuntu allows for defense, because if you're going to be concerned about the well-being of your people, if you encounter a Monsanto, you will destroy the Monsanto if you have the means to, right? Because Monsanto is threatening the well-being of your community. So companies with African names, again, we've seen this in How Europe Developed Africa. Just because an entity is named something East Africa, something Kenyan, right? A few months ago, I encountered the Kenyan Wall Street group on LinkedIn. And to my surprise, maybe it shouldn't be to my surprise, the head of the Kenyan Wall Street in Kenya is a Mzungu, straight up sitting there having events. They have events regularly on LinkedIn talking about how this Mzungu is going to help you understand how to survive in Kenya. A Mzungu, a foreigner. So you all in Kenya have lost your minds. And you like to say I'm the one who's lost my mind. So, but when we sit down and look at logic, I am coming to you all and saying you've lost your mind. I've seen a couple of Kenyan women, the one particular one I was looking at, sitting right next to this Mzungu, speaking in support of this Mzungu and acting like everything is okay. You two Kenyan women at that event have lost your mind. You have lost your mind. And you need to sit back and reflect and think, what am I doing? How am I attending an event in Kenya, speaking to my fellow Kenyans, where it is led by a Mzungu, and this Mzungu is telling us how to function within our own country? How is that making sense? And why am I a part of it? Why am I not joining fellow Kenyans to fight the system of taxation instead of talking to them about how to survive under it, when I know very well it is a duped system, like it's a what's it called? A dysfunctional system that has been intentionally designed that way. So there's no surviving under that system. There really isn't. There is barely surviving under that system. So for you to be a WanaUbuntu who joins those sessions of pretend, let's pretend to show you how you'll survive when you understand clearly. And maybe you don't understand. And if you don't understand, then you need to open your eyes and start educating yourself. You need to start watching more of our sessions on Kumbukeni and sharing them not just virtually, but everywhere you go, telling Kenyans to stop and watch take time to watch our sessions. In Confessions of an Economic Hitman, John Perkins says that those economic hitmen work through getting nations to take an unsustainable debt to fund infrastructure projects that benefit foreign corporations more than the local people. So if you think that, and this is very timely, that the trip that the African leaders, so-called leaders, WanaUbuntu so-called leaders, and actually we're calling them African because they are under that system, took just the other day to go to China, and they're getting all these loans, right? Which is essentially means debt, because they will default on the loans. For sure, they will default on the loans. So if you think that this trip that was just recently taken is to help you, no, it's not to. And in fact, this is what you Kenyans need to start doing. For those of you who've not been following, look at the trip today. Look at what is promised. Look at what your leaders, so-called leaders, come back and tell you, and then start monitoring it. Those of you who can do data collection, start monitoring it, see how it progresses, and then look at the next time the government sits to tell you what their next infrastructure, financial bill, or whatever expenditure bill is going to be. Look at it, and you will see the effects of what they did this week on that, reflected on those bills. So we have companies, for example, Walter Rodney names companies, Barclays, I mentioned, Lloyd's of London. There was a whole list, and let me actually go back because I want to name all these companies. It is essential to get the criminals and get the specific names. You don't want to, I say Walter Rodney has basically given us the evidence that we need to follow to make our case and indict these companies. Did I not list them down? They're actually in chapter 6. Let me get them. I have them marked here. Bear with me. Oh, yes. So in page, I'm going to read it. On page 253, as indicated earlier, many of the entrepreneurs from the big European port towns who turned to importing African agricultural produce into Europe were formerly carrying on the trade in slaves. The same can be said of many New England farms in the United States. Some of the biggest names in the colonial epoch were capitalist concerns whose original capital came from the trade in slaves or from slavery itself. Lloyd's, the great insurance underwriting and banking house, falls into this category. Having been nourished by profits from the slave territories of the West Indies in the 17th and 18th centuries, the ubiquitous Barclays Bank had its antecedents in slaving trading. In slave trading, Worms et Compagnie is a French example of the same phenomenon. Back in the 18th century, Worms had strong links with the French slave trade, and it grew to become one of the most powerful financial houses dealing with the French Empire in Africa and Asia, with particular concentration on Madagascar and the Indian Ocean. The example of Unilever. You all, I have used lotion, but now when I look closely, it says Unilever. It's everywhere, Unilever. Like I'm talking about the products that we are using. And the UAC, which was highlighted in the previous chapter, also chapter 5, also reinforces the point that Africa was being exploited by capital produced out of African labor. When Lever brothers of Unilever took over the Niger Company, this is how Nigeria was started, through the Niger Company, in 1929, they became heirs to one of the most notorious exploiters of 19th century Africa. The Niger Company was a chartered company with full governmental and police powers during the years 1885 to 1897. There's a song Burna Boy sings. He says, let me tell you a story. He starts with, let me tell you a story of how the Nigeria started as a company or something. Whoever remembers that song by Burna Boy, put the title in the chat. In that period, the company exploited Nigerians ruthlessly. Furthermore, the Niger Company was itself a monopoly that had bought up smaller firms tracing their capital directly to slave trading. If you think these companies are not still operating within our motherland today, you are fooled and you need to awaken. You need to take away the clouds, whatever it is that is covering your eyes so that you can see, because we need you to see so that we can awaken as a united force. Similarly, when the USA, furthermore, the Niger Company was itself a monopoly that had bought up smaller firms tracing their capital directly to slave trading. Similarly, when the UAC was born out of the merger with the Eastern and African Trading Company. Again, what is the company called? The Eastern and African Trading. Has nothing to do with Eastern African as far as rebuilding it. It has everything to do with the exploitation. Excuse me. It was associated with some more capital that grew from a family tree rooted in the European slave trade. The capital at the disposal of the big French trading firms CFAO and SCOA can also be traced in the same way. He names many other companies, right? Trading firm of Smith Mackenzie. You just look at chapter 6 and take note. I have advised this before. You have Diamond, it's a diamond company, right? So just go look at those names. Like just go, in my book, I have them marked. So just go marking those names in the book. And then put them down and start researching. You will see what they're called today. Because like I said before, these multinational companies change their names or they're taken over by a bigger company in order to distance themselves from their criminal activities. It is 38. Let me hurry and stop digressing. So again, we see they controlled agriculture and economic, they created an economic dependency if they're controlling agriculture. The role of education in colonial and neo-colonial systems. Walter Rodney tells us that education was designed to create a working class. That was the main goal. It was not to civilize you. You were supposed to be a working class. Even when you were being forced to speak English, it was so that they don't have to hear you speaking. First of all, they understand the power of your African languages. So it was to detach you from that power. But also, if you're going to be saying, yes, ma'am, yes, master, they want to hear you sounding really good. And there's a certain sickness, there's a certain psychopathy in controlling someone's tongue to speak like you. And I'm certain they got pleasure from that. So just given the encounters I have had with these people and how they speak from their own tongues, the confessions that they have given without realizing they are, that could serve a working class, that could serve colonial businesses, not to empower Africans with skills for self-development. Even to this day, most of you have access to education that only allows you to be working class, to show up at 8, 9 to 5 or 4 at the office and work for those companies. And they don't teach you business skills. And it is very hard to get into those education spaces that actually teach you skills that will liberate you from the system, from the labor force system. So the colonial schools produced clerks, engineers, and scientists to be used within those systems, right? The scientists, you've seen how scientists have been used in these imperial system. Today, a lot of the scientists on Ubuntu, the WanaUbuntu scientists, are being used to do work for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation with their partnership with Monsanto, right? So you have our scientists behind closed doors looking into GMOs and seeing how, and taking our seeds, our original seeds, and manipulating them to see how they can convert them into GMO seeds so that they can control your production of food and they can generate income, huge revenue through it. Because if you are going to use a seed that they have produced, and if they are going to put on policies, or to force your governments to put on policies that are going to prevent you from growing or preserving, which means you will no longer have those seeds, original seeds, then you're going to be dependent on them. The only place where you will go to buy these seeds to grow will be them. And these seeds are designed where when you grow them once, they cannot grow again. So you think you're going to store them in your granary and grow them next year? No, that crop you will not yield anything from that. And therefore you must go. First of all, you will learn the hard way, because you will have, if you're not aware as a farmer, most of them are not, they will save the seeds and grow them next year, and they will not grow. That will be a whole season. And therefore, while they wait for the next rains, they'll be dependent on the grocery stores. I'm telling you, these people have mastered genius strategy of generating revenue from us. Neo-colonial powers today often invest in Africa's education, but with an agenda. Today, Chinese-funded schools in Africa focus on Chinese language and technical skills that will serve Chinese companies. So how can we transform education truly to serve African development, right? That is the focus. Our education has to serve African development. Our education has to serve African needs. Our education has to serve Ubuntu well-being. So if your education, and you go and you learn about the United States and their history, you should walk out of that class. In fact, we as parents and the students should rebel against that type of education and force our system to implement an education system that when I go to class, I'll be learning about Nakuru, I'll be learning about Kisumu, and not just the colonial history, but also how they were thriving communities before the invasion, and how we can continue to be. The things that WanaUbuntu Africans have done in those locations is what we should be teaching. So I decided to look into, let me pull it up. What are the consequences I was looking into? What are the consequences of the debt? Because, and this is specifically because these so-called leaders are out in China this week, again, taking on loans that are clearly and for certain going to be defaulted on, and therefore are going to be debt. What are the consequences on us, right? The loss of national assets and resources, because I said, like, when many of these Chinese loans are tied to critical infrastructure projects, right? The ports, railways, power plants that serve as collateral. In the event of a default, China can seize or take control of these strategic assets. For example, Sri Lanka had to lease its Hambantota port to China for 99 years after failing to repay Chinese loans. Speaking of leasing, isn't that what is happening right now with the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport? That it's gonna be leased to the Indian company? Similar concerns have arisen with African infrastructure projects like Kenya's Mombasa port. Who is in control of the Kenya Mombasa port? Who is leasing? Like, go ahead and look, Google. Who is leasing Kenya's Mombasa port? And you'll understand what those loans that were defaulted on are doing to us in Kenya, right? The other way that we lose our national assets and resources through this debt, these loans that are going to be defaulted on and therefore will become debt. I am going to show you the chain. The reason we have debt is because we took loans and we defaulted on them. But it wasn't our intention to default on them. They have been decided outside of our own understanding, but now we have no excuse as far as understanding, right? Especially if you're in government, you have to start, at one point you have to start. If you've been going back and getting the loans and always defaulting and getting into debt, you have to stop and ask yourself, dude, what the hell is going on? Why do I keep defaulting? I'm working very hard to make sure that so that's another strategy too. A lot of these leaders in WanaUbuntu and wherever else there are marginalized nations have been put in that place where these loans will for sure also enrich them. And therefore, because they're being enriched, they don't stop to question. And therefore, they won't do this thing that I'm advising us all to do, where they stop and question, why are things the way they are? They won't do that. But us who have the ability to and who are being exploited, who are suffering the most from the system, have to stop and ask ourselves, who is currently leasing Kenya's Mombasa port and why? So some of the loans are backed by access to natural resources, such as oil, minerals, and agriculture. If a country defaults, China may gain increased control over these resources, diminishing the country's ability to benefit from its own wealth. Ask yourself on Mombasa Road, why are you seeing an increase after the SGR railway, right? It wasn't paid for. And then all of a sudden, a few years down the line, you see there's an increased building of Chinese-owned apartments that are being leased at really high rental rates. Ask yourself, why is that happening? To the point where the Kenyan government is leasing some of the land that was considered originally wildlife territory that you as a Kenyan could not build on, but now the Chinese are building apartments on. These are the things we must ask ourselves. Why am I seeing increased Chinese buildings and businesses in Kenya? Because we have defaulted on loans. And because those were the conditions of those loans. If you don't pay, we get access to this. Increased debt dependence and vulnerability. So if you're in a system that is dependent on loans and you're defaulting, and if you default, you still need to finance the system, your government, you still have to govern your nation, right? You don't have the money to govern. So what are you doing? Again, you're catching the plane to go to China to get some more loans that you're going to default on, and then you're going to be in debt and you won't be able to pay for them. So again, you're going to go back and get the loan. So we as WanaUbuntu have to say enough of the loans. And in fact, when the Kenyan president comes back, you all have to ask him, what the hell did you do and how are you going to repay it, right? It's very frustrating to see ourselves in a cycle of subjugation that we will never get out of if we continue to go along to get along. We really will never get out of it. But the day we decide, I'm willing to go through a little pain to stop this cycle, right? After all, we're going through pain right now. Those of you who say, Nduko, you have to start talking about positive things. I don't know how possible it is to talk about positive things when there are no positive. There's a shortage of positive things. When you look around, again, it's a death economy, and all around you is death. Right? I can talk about how we had a barbecue with my friends, how I went for my walk, it was lovely, but those are the few things, and they actually are not really contributing. For me to focus on positive right now is for me to allow the system to continue, because I'm not showing you how it's paining us. So I must come like this squeaky wheel to remind us how it hurts. Because the minute you stop feeling the pain, it will be the minute you go along with the system. So this is why I focus on the pain, so that we can feel it. Because when we feel the pain, we will do something about it. All right. Another consequence of the Chinese trip, right? The constant trips to China is we just talked about increased dependency on vulnerability. Both the original one, right? The loss of control of our resources, of our land, of our infrastructure, and then the debt dependency and vulnerability results into impaired sovereignty, right? You're no longer a sovereign nation and autonomy, because you can't make decisions for yourself. Because if these businesses are operating, and if these nations are operating within your nation, they have to make the conditions cushy for themselves, and therefore they are now influencing your policies. And you're no longer a sovereign nation. No matter how many times you celebrate your Independence Day, I don't care how many times you have these events to celebrate your Independence Day. You can wear as many Kenyan t-shirts and many Kenyan hats and bracelets as you want. Kenya is not sovereign. Neither is Zambia, neither is Nigeria, neither is Democratic Republic of Congo, or the Republic of Congo, or South Africa, or Zimbabwe, or Mozambique, or Namibia, or Angola, or Nigeria, or Ghana, or Ivorian Coast. Name them. Any African nation. There's no African nation, Ubuntu nation, that is a sovereign nation today. None of them has autonomy. So you lose policy control. Countries are forced to adopt policies that serve China and the West, their economic and geopolitical interests, right? This affects decisions on resource management, foreign relations, domestic development priority. Why do you think these nations are being forced to take on LGBT laws? Not saying one way or another about the laws, but why do you think it is being forced, right? These nations should take on these policies on their own. Why should the West tell us we need to be fair to our fellow human beings who have chosen different sexual paths or identities? We need to come to this as our own, as human beings. We shouldn't be forced by any other nation. But why is it that we're in a situation where the nations are forcing these policies on us? Because we have defaulted on the loans and we are not sovereign. So essentially, defaulting on these loans, the nations lose their ability to make independent policy choices. This is why you have policies that don't make sense, and you ask yourself, has Ruto lost his mind? Why is he introducing, and Ruto probably who eats ndengu and loves eating ndengu, why is he introducing all those government members I am certain have sat down and enjoyed a meal of ndengu? Why are they putting a policy that is banning the growing of ndengu by us? Clearly because they've been forced to, because they defaulted on a law and they have no choice. They're not sovereign. They have no autonomy. They're puppets. Essentially, when the imperialist pulls the string, your hand moves up. Pulls the other string, your hand moves up. Pulls the string down, your hand goes down. You are not in control of your body movements as a puppet. And this is an analogy. We're talking about your government and the policies. Military and strategic implications. Some loans are tied to military cooperation or infrastructure that could have, again, Kenya just recently joined NATO, not as a partner, not as one of the members, of the core members, no, as a side, whatever it is that they're calling themselves, right? So in the event of a default, China could gain increased military or security presence on Ubuntu, challenging the sovereignty of the nation, further challenging, not just because we already established the sovereignty has been challenged by the first two consequences. And therefore, we come now to the ultimate, or one of the ultimate consequences, negative economic impact. The damage to credit worthiness. Here now we're talking about the Kenyan shilling, the Tanzanian shilling, whatever it is, what is it in Zambia? The kwacha, right? Their value is reduced, and all of a sudden you're seeing the rates going up. For the diaspora, and this is part of the reason why some of us go along to get along, it's an advantage because when you send money home, it's going like, and when you travel home with a dollar, it goes a long way, right? So it's good for you, but it's not good for your people. It's not good for our people, and it's not good for our homes, which should be a concern of ours, which should offend us. So the damage to credit worthiness. Defaulting can severely damage a nation's reputation in global financial markets. This could result in higher interest rates on future loans. So now, not only are you dependent on loans, but those loans are now going to have higher interest rates, which means you're definitely not paying them. You're defaulting. Making borrowing more expensive. So now the cost of defaulting gets higher. If you all do not see this as colonialism, that we will end up having no control, like physically and whichever other way you can think of it, of our continent, please, I'm asking you to wake up, please. I'm not going to insult you today. Today, I'm begging you, please wake up, because this is where we are heading. Stagnation of development projects. Again, there's, I forget his name. Let me see. I opened my Twitter because I follow him, he's probably going to come up as one of the people, the new posts there. He's a brother in Kenya who's been exposing the Kenyan government's stalled projects. Because you all think like we're making up this shit, right? You all think we're just here talking and we're making up all this, and you want to say, Nduko, what are you doing? Let me show you a real example. That this guy is in Kenya showing you today real examples of stagnation of development projects. And you just think it's Ruto, but it's not just Ruto. It is because of the system that he's been tied up with, that he has allowed, because the system is intentionally designed to make him rich so that he is quiet and he doesn't fight it, and so that he keeps going along. And those leaders who have said, I don't want to be rich, I want my nation to be rich, have been killed. And if you read the confessions of an economic hitman, you will see the evidence of these leaders who've decided, I don't want to be rich by myself. I want my people to be rich. How they've been killed, how they've been threatened to be killed, and therefore went along in order to avoid that death. Why am I not seeing him? For those of you who know who I'm talking about, oh yeah, there he is. Morara, right? Morara has been going around, and Kenyan, like Africans, sometimes we are ridiculous. Just because Morara is going around exposing the government, does not mean that he's qualified to be president. Our standards have to be higher. That's just one qualifications. Does he meet the other qualifications? So Morara, M-O-R-A-R-A. Those of you on Twitter, look up Morara. You'll see how he's been exploiting one of these consequences of defaulted loans: debt, stagnation of development projects. Infrastructure projects funded by Chinese loans may be halted or operate under Chinese control if defaults occur. You've all seen those trains being driven by Chinese men in Kenya. This could delay or stop projects critical for development, leading to economic stagnation or regression. Inflation and devaluation. As countries default, they may experience inflation or currency devaluation. I explained that, making it harder to import essential goods and raising the cost of living for their citizens. Harder, which means that it's going to be high cost importing, which means on the grocery aisles, the way that affects you, regular mwananchi, is the prices will go up. Then geopolitical and strategic consequences, the shift in alliances. African nations in default may be compelled, right, to align their foreign policy more closely with China's. We should not be in a situation where we are forced to align with any nation. We have to choose to align with the nations, not forced to align with the nations. And we align with them after a critical analysis of who they are and how they run and what that relationship means for us. That's the only way, the only strategy that should be used to aligning with other nations. Now, African nations, you see them when they're talking about our partner now is China, they didn't get there willingly. They've been forced through the defaulted loans to partner with China. Public discontent and unrest, the loss of sovereignty and economic hardship. Again, public discontent. Sometimes I sit here when I'm talking about this and I feel like Mama Kanyisile has said this before. I want to just go around whipping you all, my fellow WanaUbuntu, just whipping you into reality and awareness, and into being offended by what is happening so that you can do something. Public discontent and unrest. The Kenyan maandamano, right? The Kenyan protests, the Nigerian protests, the loss of sovereignty and economic hardship resulting from loans defaults can lead to widespread public discontent. This may trigger political instability, protests, and changes in government. Like, come on, y'all. Seriously, we need to keep coming here to remind you that things are not right and we need to do something about it. The risk of corruption and poor governance. Those of you who think corruption is an African trait, here you go. It's not. It is the result of defaulted loans, debt. Right? Chinese loans are often less transparent than those, again, because you thought that they are not as bad as the West, less transparent than those from Western lenders. And in some cases, their terms are not made public. That opacity, as in opaque, can lead to corruption, where government officials misuse funds or agree to unfavorable terms that benefit elites rather than the broader population. Weakened accountability. Defaulting governments might have reduced leverage to negotiate, leaving them more vulnerable to external pressure and less accountable to their own citizens. The lack of accountability can worsen governance issues and hinder development. Environmental and social consequences. In cases where natural resources are used as collateral defaults, can lead to increased exploitation of natural resources. In Congo, you're seeing they're destroying the trees because of their timber manufacturing, right? Forced resettlement. Again, we talked about the Maasai community in Tanzania. They're being forced to move out of their own land. I'm calling all you WanaUbuntu, all you Africans, to action. It is time to be offended. It is time to understand how the system works. If you cannot, join Kumbukeni, subscribe, follow, and watch the videos here so that you understand how the system works. And then do something about it. do whatever it takes to destroy that system, right? Let me look quickly in the chat, a couple of minutes that we have left, see whether there are any questions. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for your continued support of Kumbukeni. Yes. On education, we need to build decentralized, starting at the family level onwards, education system. I agree. Institutions that educate our children, re-educate our adults. I agree. On nation building, nation management, how to build, manage power. Now, not how to become fear-driven, mindless workers with the West or the East as our economic, political, infrastructural, spiritual North Star. Principles like Obulungisa. Yes, those of you who don't know Obulungisa, look into Mama Kanyisile's upcoming book and support us, by the way, to raise the funds that are needed to publish that book. I thank you all. I hope this session was helpful. Please awaken, my brothers and sisters, my African WanaUbuntu brothers and sisters, because our lives are dependent on it. Please awaken so that we can rebuild our motherland and our people. Asanteni, siku njema, kwaherini.